Over the last few days, we've seen a lot of discussion about Juneteenth, which just happened on June the 19th this year, and it marks the emancipation of black people who suffered under chattel slavery in the United States. But it's clear from a lot of the discussions we've seen in recent days that a few of the facts have gotten missed, and here's a couple of them. Number one, President Abraham Lincoln did not free the slaves. He did not free the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation was not to free the slaves, but really it was a wartime tactic which was introduced to put pressure on the Confederacy. And if you look at the facts, there were many border states in the north, including places like Kentucky and Delaware, which still continued to have slaves after the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, number two, Juneteenth, which should be celebrated and does celebrate the emancipation of black people under slavery, is not for everybody. This is for black American slave descendants very specifically. Now, a lot of people will get upset about this, but you don't see black American descendants of slaves being invited or shoehorning their way into other celebrations for other groups. There's nothing wrong with different groups celebrating their individual struggles and celebrations, and there's also nothing wrong with groups coming together, but Juneteenth is for black American descendants of slaves, because we can't talk about Juneteenth without talking about the demand for reparations for black American descendants of slaves. Now, if you look at the prison system, you look at policing, you look at housing inequality, education, employment, all of these disparities have a direct correlation and trace their timeline back to slavery. And that's before you even talk about the psychological intergenerational trauma experienced by black American descendants of slaves. Black Americans who descend from slaves are far more likely to suffer certain diseases, heart disease and many other diseases, and increasingly the evidence is showing us that this directly correlates to the fact that intergenerationally the trauma as well as the disparities were passed down to them. Now, if we're talking again about reparations for black American descendants of slaves, we have to really acknowledge that this is specific just to them. Now, other groups have made successfully different claims over the years. For example, Alaskans, Japanese Americans, Jews who suffered under the Holocaust, and no one would ever for a second believe that black Americans could somehow get in on their reparations claim. So the reparations for slavery is specific to black American slave descendants. I literally know people in the US where slavery was 2 or 3 people ago in their family, but people love to say it was long ago. There are no longer any people who were slaves alive, and there are no longer any people who owned slaves that are alive. This argument is defunct if you just look at all the expert groups that can prove how wealth handed over to the slave owners, wealth generated by the slave owners, is still in circulation in the economy, but not just that. If we're talking about reparations, we have to talk about Tulsa in Oklahoma. Now, for those that don't know, just over 100 years ago, one of the worst examples of racial terrorism took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where 200 or 300 black Americans were killed in race riots. And that's exactly what they were. There's a lot of whataboutery. A lot of other people have tried to claim there were general riots that took place. Not so. There was scores, mobs of white people that descended on black people in Tulsa. They murdered them and they burned down what was known as the Black Wall Street. Now, this is not the only, but one of the worst examples of racial terrorism, and there's been a reparations claim made to the federal government, made to the government over many, many years. Now, regarding slavery, some people argue it was so long ago, there's no argument to be made. There are literal survivors. And the authorities in Oklahoma have just ruled that the reparations claim is not going to happen. They've thrown out the reparations claim. So when you hear people talk about Juneteenth, when you hear people talk about reparations claims, we need to be clear about exactly what that means. And we need to always remember that Juneteenth is specifically for black American descendants of slaves. Reparations is a legitimate claim regarding slavery, and of course, if we talk about reparations, we have to talk about what went down in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the absolute legitimate reparations claim that must be paid to those living people that suffered that trauma that are still alive today.